Okay, young adults, for this video, you are going to need your Module 9 notes out on your desk. You're going to need your parts of a neuron packet, and you should take out some colored markers, highlighters, pens, etc., because we're going to annotate the diagram of the neuron. Specifically for this video, we're going to focus on the neuron. We left off talking about the synapse, but we'll kind of review the whole neuron. So take a second. Get out your packet. This is what your packet looks like. Parts of the neuron. This is the part that we did in class. You're going to go ahead and flip it to page 2. So on the back of this packet, we're going to work on this diagram kind of as a review. Okay? So if you look, we're going to kind of start at the beginning. This whole thing is trying to show you the outline of a single neuron. Okay? So as you look, the first part of the neuron that we're going to label will be in orange, and it's all of these pieces like we did before. Okay? And all of those pieces are referred to as dendrites. Okay? Dendrites we talked about in class. Those are the parts of the neuron that receive messages and conduct impulses towards the center of the cell. Okay? So it's going to receive the information. So once it receives the information, it's then going to pass it onward to here. And this piece we will refer to as the cell body or soma. And this is what we would call the energy source of the cell. Okay? So the message gets received by dendrites. It's going to funnel that message towards the cell body. From the cell body, that message is going to get sent towards the axon. Okay? So the axon is going to be in the center of that. It's in red. Okay? So I'm going to be pointing to this one in particular. So this is the axon. The axon is the extension of the neuron. The extension of the neuron that passes messages toward a receiving neuron. Now, it could go to something else besides a neuron. It could go to a muscle, or it could go to a gland. Okay? Also, we need to make sure that we know this is the longest part of a neuron. Okay? It's the longest part. The longest axons that you have in your body are going to be in your leg. So here's the axon. Okay? The axon, if you look at kind of this arrow, this black arrow, okay, it's trying to show you that that is the action potential. Okay? Trying to show you, once again, that that is the action potential. That is essentially the message, right? An action potential is the neural impulse, okay, that is generated by excitatory impulses. Okay, so the action potential only goes one way. Right? It's going to only go from the cell body towards the end of the neuron, which would be your terminal buttons. Okay, so that's the action potential. Once again, it's a neural impulse. It is also the electrical part. It involves positive and negative ions, so that's why we refer to it as electrical. Okay, let's zoom in. Now, covering the axon, you see these kind of links. Those links are referred to as the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is a fatty tissue that coats an axon and speeds up the rate of the impulse. Okay, and the way it speeds it up is instead of traveling all the way down the axon, the impulse actually jumps to those kind of sausage links in between. Those nodes are called nodes of our NVA. Okay? If your myelin sheath deteriorates, there's a disorder where the myelin sheath deteriorates. It's called MS, which is multiple sclerosis. And it's the deteriorating of myelin. It kind of goops up. Sometimes it's like holes in the myelin, and it slows down those neural impulses. Okay? So we've gone, dendrites receive the information. They funnel that impulse or that information to the soma. The soma is going to funnel that impulse towards the action potential, or in this case the axon, which is going to generate an action potential. That action potential is going to travel down the axon, which is speeded up because it's covered in myelin. And then it's going to go to, at the very end, you have these buttons. So on these buttons, we're going to call those terminal buttons. And the terminal buttons are on the branches, right? Terminal branches, they have the buttons. And if you notice, this right here is the outline of another neuron. This is a second neuron. So you can see that the terminal buttons look like they're touching the next neuron, when in fact they're actually not. Okay? So if you look, what this is trying to show you, if you took this little square right here, it's blowing it up. So this arrow is trying to show you what's happening in that little square. Okay? So what's happening in that little square, that would mean this is actually our terminal button. Okay? So, like we talked about before, the action potential goes down the axon into the terminal button, and you can see it here. This is meant to be the action potential coming down. Okay? So that electrical impulse, this action potential, is coming down into this whole thing, which is the terminal button. Right? So this whole thing is a terminal button, which is at the end of a neuron. Okay? So as the action potential comes down into the terminal button, it's going to start activating these orbs, if you will. Right? These sacs. So all of these are different sacs. Okay? And these sacs are referred to as vesicles. Okay? Inside vesicles, so I'll put their sacs containing, so inside of them, you can find neurotransmitters. Things like dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine. So those are types of neurotransmitters. So these vesicles hold neurotransmitters. I'll do the neurotransmitters in blue. So all these kind of dots inside these vesicles are neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are chemicals. Okay? So when we're talking about neurotransmitters, we'll label what they are. I think there's an arrow. We'll draw an arrow right here. So these are neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that cross the synapse and bind with a receiving neuron. Okay? So there's a couple of vocab words that were mentioned there, right? So that means that this right here, right? This would be the receiving neuron. More specifically, this would probably be the dendrite of a receiving neuron, because we talked about how dendrites receive information. Okay, so here's the dendrite of the receiving neuron. And so these neurotransmitters that we had in blue, okay, these are all neurotransmitters. When the action potential comes down into the terminal button, it activates the vesicles, which in turn activate the neurotransmitters, and those vesicles start moving down towards the end of the terminal button. And what's going to happen is that those vesicles will then open and release neurotransmitters into the gap between the receiving neuron and the terminal button of the sending neuron. And this gap, which is meant to be shown right here, we'll do it right here. This is the gap. It's called the synapse. You see it as synapse, sometimes you see it as synaptic cleft or synaptic gap. It's all the same thing. Okay? And a synapse is simply put a gap between two neurons. Two neurons are never supposed to touch. Okay? So the synapse would be the gap between two neurons. This little gap, it's very small, between the sending neuron and the receiving neuron. Okay? So when the neurotransmitter is going to cross the synapse, it potentially can bind at the receiving site of the receiving neuron. When enough neurotransmitters bind, it's going to send an excitatory signal, and that means it's going to create an impulse in the next neuron. And so it's going to keep that message going, right? So once again, kind of a little quick recap. Dendrites are the part of a neuron that receive information. Okay, so it's going to receive the information, it's going to funnel it towards the cell body, and the cell body is going to funnel it towards the axon. The axon is going to create an action potential. An action potential is a neural impulse that is the message, right? The message is this electrical charge. It's going to travel down the axon, which is encased in myelin, so it's going to go faster, and it's going to move into the terminal button. As it moves into the terminal button, the electrical charge is going to activate these vesicles that have neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters are going to move to the end of the terminal button, and they're going to be released into the synapse. Once they're floating around the synapse, they potentially can bind with the receiving neuron, and if there's enough excitatory signals, that receiving neuron will then generate an impulse of its own. Okay? Once these receiving neurotransmitters bind, they will basically disembark, if you will, and they will actually be reabsorbed back into the terminal button, right? That's a process called reuptake. Okay, so the process of reuptake is when a neurotransmitter is reabsorbed by the sending neuron. Okay, so once it's going to latch on to the receiving neuron, it's going to most likely generate an impulse. Then, after a period of time, it depends on the neurotransmitter, it will then move back across the synapse into the sending neuron to repeat this process over and over again. Okay, that was our little recap of a neuron. Hope you enjoyed my lovely voice.